Driven by desperation and running for their lives, almost half of all Syrians have been forced from their homes. As the death toll nears 200,000 in a conflict becoming ever more complex and seemingly ever more difficult to resolve. Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Syria. I'm Sohail Rahman. The United Nations says the crisis in Syria has become the biggest humanitarian emergency of our time. But the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, says the world is failing to meet the needs of refugees or countries hosting them. And the numbers keep on rising. 3 million Syrians have now registered as refugees in neighbouring countries. That's 1 million more than a year ago. And host governments estimate hundreds of thousands of others are unaccounted for. A further 6.5 million people are displaced within Syria, meaning almost half of all Syrians have been forced to abandon their homes. So let me introduce you to our guests for this edition of Inside Syria. With me here in the studio is Mahjoob Zweiri, Professor of Contemporary History of the Middle East at Qatar University. In Vienna, Austria, we have Melissa Fleming, spokeswoman for the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR. And joining us from our London studio is Sajjan Gohel, Director of the International Security for Asia Pacific Foundation. To my guests, welcome. Melissa Fleming, let me just come to you first. For 3 years, the UN have told us that the crisis is getting worse, and we've heard statements in the past couple of days alluding to that. But to describe it as the worst humanitarian emergency of our era is profound. Do you think it's really going to kickstart the international community in helping?
Well, we certainly hope so. And we say that because the scale of the suffering and the numbers of people who've had to run for their lives, coupled with the conditions people are arriving in, shockingly weak, terrified, depleted of all savings, many ill or injured, it points to a worsening situation inside Syria and desperate needs once they escape.
But how desperate has that picture been? I mean, can you paint or give us an idea of what it was like 3 years ago and how that situation has got worse right now? I mean, what factors have made it such a desperate situation?
Well, obviously the war, the violence has spread over the years. We talked to a woman who has been displaced inside Syria 20 times because of shifting front lines. So she'll find one safe pocket, and then the war or the conflict spread to that village and had to flee again and again and again until finally, and many are saying really it is the last resort for us to have to leave our country. And it's expensive. Smugglers cost a fortune for people in Syria these days. But once they do take the decision to flee to a neighboring country, that we're finding they're arriving in with absolutely nothing in many cases and hugely traumatized. So it's the length of the conflict, what people have had to endure for such a long period of time, almost no medical help and poor food supply, etc. We're seeing a growing trend of particularly vulnerable people.
I'll elaborate on the statistics of where all the displaced are in a moment, but you often appeal for funds and help from the international community. One might ask, why are those funds not in place at times of peace? And who's going to bankroll it now? Because there's a great deal of aid apathy around in the international community with so many conflicts globally.
In a way, I don't know if I would call it aid apathy, because countries have been extremely generous, but they have come to the end of their own humanitarian budgets. No one perhaps could foresee this number of conflicts erupting and this number of people on the run. We have more people forcibly displaced on this earth today, 50 million people, than any time since World War II. People with extraordinary needs. And so what we're saying to the countries, the traditional donors, the wealthy donors, please find other pockets of aid so that we can help the victims of these conflicts. And we're appealing to non-traditional donors, people who have never funded us, as well as the private sector, to come forward for the sake of humanity.
OK, well, before we come to our other two guests, let's just take a quick look at just where those Syrian refugees have fled to. Now, on the 3 million displaced outside the country, Lebanon has most with nearly 1.2 million. Turkey is next with more than 800,000, and more than 600,000 have fled to Jordan. Iraq has more than 200,000 Syrians and Egypt has nearly 140,000. And of the 6.5 million people who have been displaced within Syria itself, more than half are said to be children. Rula Amin reports now from Lebanon's Bekaa Valley.
They endured the loss of their homes and settled in tents. They endured the snow and its bitter cold, endured the extreme heat and the lack of water and electricity, lost their jobs, lived on food rations, and survived off people's charity. But almost all refugee parents will tell you their children not going to school is one of the most devastating aspects of their refugee life.
It's a crime that these children are not going to school and learning, but there is not much I can do.
Abdulrazak Ahmoud came from Aleppo a year and a half ago. His 14 children have not been to a proper school in 2 years. Some of the refugee children are lucky to be enrolled at public schools in Lebanon, but they have to struggle to catch up with a curriculum they are not familiar with. Some NGOs offer basic alternative schooling, but the children won't get any credit or certificate for it. Some of the refugee children have not been to schools in 3 years, and it's unlikely they will be able to enroll this year.
My children's future is destroyed. We used to dream that our children would become doctors or engineers. Now our ambition is to find a place to sleep in and to stay alive till the next day.
A whole generation of Syrians is under threat, and so is the future of Syria. Rula Amin, Al Jazeera, Akkar, Northern Lebanon.
Professor Mahjoob Zweiri from Qatar University is with me in the studio. And when you listen to that report, you get a real sense of the desperation in one small area of the Middle East where this has affected so many. You're watching this conflict from within the Middle East. What sort of effect is it having on the Arab psyche to see the displacement of so many Arabs from one nation?
It has a bad impact. I mean, of course, you know, those countries would witness now the refugees. They witnessed more wave of refugees before. Let's remember that Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Egypt, they witnessed a lot of wave of refugees from Palestinians in previous years. There is a history of suffering they witnessed before. So basically, they are not really happy to see that kind of cycle, you know, continues, especially seeing their brothers are suffering again. Of course, there is a lot of concern about, you know, the ramification of this on their life, whether in those countries, because basically those refugees, they need more service, which affect the people's life in those countries. So basically there is a concern on two levels. One, because their brothers are suffering, but also the impact on their service offered by the governments on those countries. And I think this increased the level of concern in those countries.
I think, Melissa Fleming, you touched on that actually, about the level of help that neighbouring countries can also give to the refugees. But you recently talked about a handful of Syrians returning to Syria, or those that are fleeing Iraq to get into Syria, two disparate positions on leaving one refugee camps and the other looking for refuge. It's bad all round, really, isn't it?
It really is. Since the conflict spilled over into Iraq, the Syrians who had found safety and calm in particularly the Kurdistan region of Iraq are now terrified, actually. And we're seeing 300 a day deciding to return to Syria. From the Anbar province, we saw Yazidis actually fleeing to Syria, and we're trying to help them in a quickly established camp in northern Syria. So it has to be a really bad situation if you choose to return or to flee to Syria. But for the most part, people are still leaving Syria and finding shelter in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Turkey.
And of course, with all that going on, I suppose the politicians really do look at the possibility of military action. Let's just also bring you what the US think. Well, the US has been reluctant to take military action in Syria, but it does seem that President Barack Obama may be laying the groundwork for a possible expansion of the aerial campaign against the Islamic State group in Iraq. Obama has authorised so-called reconnaissance flights over Syria. It's understood they will involve piloted aircraft and drones. There's no suggestion they'll pave the way for airstrikes against the Islamic State targets in Syria, but a White House spokesman added that the US was willing to take military action to protect its citizens without regard to international boundaries. It's a very loaded statement to make. I want to bring in Sajjan Gohel here. Limited airstrikes by the US, a possible consideration, but certainly food for thought for politicians around the globe.
Well, the words mission creep are beginning to re-enter our lexicon. In many ways, this crisis has been growing for the last 6 months, and substantially, with ISIS spreading its tentacles right across Syria and then into Iraq. At the moment, the focus for the US is Iraq, but unfortunately, it probably, with the crisis in Syria there too, the humanitarian issue, the fact that so many people are being displaced, the fact that ISIS are gaining the momentum, it may result in the US having to extend airstrikes, and potentially other countries may also have to cooperate and assist in terms of trying to peg in ISIS, preventing them from spreading further and trying to hem in their operational reach, which is growing.
To a certain extent, you might say that the writing is on the wall, because surveillance aircraft were certainly seen over Iraq before strikes on the IS. Is a sceptical individual around the world thinking this might not happen, but the reality on the ground that it has to happen?
The strategy that the US are pursuing is airstrikes. It is important to some extent because it did repel IS from getting further into the capital of Iraq, Baghdad. They'd got very close. Already they took major cities like Fallujah, Bakuba. But airstrikes are not going to finish or dismantle IS. It's not like dealing with, say, Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. This is not a clandestine terrorist group operating in a few villages. IS is operating effectively as an alternative government. They control swathes of territory. Airstrikes in Iraq or Syria is not going to confine their operational space, but it is the strategy that is currently being initiated, and it's one that probably will spread at some point into Syria. It's a question of when and not if.
When or if, Professor, but also the consideration for President Obama is that he's damned if he does and he's damned if he doesn't by lawmakers in his own country for either not doing enough or doing too much without consulting them.
Let's admit, Sohail, that the United States has no will to intervene in Syria from the day one of this crisis. They wanted to monitor the situation, and when they decided to intervene, Russia blocked their intervention on different levels on the Security Council. There was the absence of international will on the first level. On the second level, there is the absence of wisdom on the level of the American administration. Basically, they have seen the crisis in a different context, and they were hoping that the issue can be solved without being intervening, because the president wants to be away of the region, away of Iraq. He has no interest to put his finger on the crisis. Now ISIS brought the United States back to the region, and they have no other option but to intervene, even with the airstrike. Let's admit that the activity of IS has raised a real concern from the friends of the United States in the region, and most of the players now, they have a real concern about the activities of ISIS. So basically, we are witnessing a wave of concern expanded everywhere in the region, which left no way to the state but to intervene. And now, as we saw in last 24 hours, that Kerry will come to the region to start working on building a new alliance to tackle ISIS, so they can answer the question of when they can intervene more to tackle this issue.
Ms. Fleming, it's slightly perhaps taking the question one step away from your own department of expertise, but UN investigators on a UN fact-finding panel, for example, Khaled and Ponte, a former chief prosecutor of the ICC, says that Syria should be referred to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. If you sort of flip it, should the international community be indicted for failing the civilians that they haven't been able to help during this crisis? They too have failed, and many governments say that they failed them.
Well, I think the governments themselves admit that they're not doing enough. From our perspective, they're also not doing enough to help the countries neighboring Syria who are taking on so much of the burden of so many refugees. When you look at the example of Lebanon that you raised before, you have over 1 million Syrian refugees in a country with a population of 4 million, a country that is itself struggling and has very serious security issues. Proportionally, if you would compare, it would be as if the entire population of Germany were to flee to the United States. I think people don't recognize what these countries have, the generosity of these countries, but also the burden, and they're not getting enough financial development or infrastructural support. So we continue to call on the world to recognize this. Also for security reasons. We do not want to see this conflict spread any further.
No.
So please help the neighboring countries and also help the victims of this conflict.
Well, if that help on a humanitarian level is potentially there, Sajjan Gohel, certainly for world leaders who will be gathering in the UK next week for a NATO summit, have possibly even thought there may be no strikes against Syria before then, certainly not from the US, but much discussion about certainly the assets and troops that are in the region, whether that's by air or on the ground. They've also got to consider what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. It's a very difficult balancing act, is it not? Not just for NATO, but for the US to decide where to deploy their assets in order to protect civilians if they need to, certainly in Syria.
So it's a very important point that you raised. If you look specifically at NATO, they've got their hands full dealing with the crisis between Ukraine and Russia. So for them, the issue in Syria and Iraq is not something that they, as an institution, will focus on. It'll be dependent on individual countries, primarily, of course, the US, but also France and Great Britain have a vested interest as well. And again, it raises the point about airstrikes because they are difficult, because yes, it is possible to specifically target some of ISIS's strategic assets. They've procured a lot of hardware, weaponry that was abandoned by the Iraqi army. But nevertheless, they've also embedded themselves into major cities. Now, one can't use airstrikes to flatten those cities because there would be significant civilian collateral damage as well. The only way this can really go forward from the time being is to try and work with groups like the Kurdish Peshmerga, the dregs of the Iraqi army, and even the Free Syria army in Syria to try and contain ISIS on the ground, because otherwise this problem isn't going to go away. There are going to be even more displaced refugees, and ultimately they're the ones who suffer the most in either scenario, because many of those refugees in Syria are sympathetic to the Free Syria army. So on the one hand, they get persecuted by the Assad regime, and on the other side, they get persecuted by ISIS.
Well, I think Mr. Gohel just touched on a point there about the West working with Peshmerga forces, the remnants of the Iraqi army. So I suppose the question is, why aren't Arab nations doing enough? Why is the perception that the West are the ones that have to solve this problem? Why can't Arab nations sort this problem out? They have armies, they have ammunition.
Two reasons may explain to us why they are not involved fully in this. One, the feeling that who's responsible actually for all of this is actually Western policies. Basically, the absence of the Syrian crisis, of not being involved from the beginning, solving the problems. For example, limited the activities of IS and other organizations is the responsibility of the West, because they were. From the beginning, they were, discussing the threat of those organizations before actually Arab countries. The second reason is actually there was a trend in the region. Arab countries are not intervening on the other, other Arab countries' issues. So basically, there are
cultural issues that stop them from interfering.
Yeah, simply not. So, because basically,
but they do interfere all the time behind the scenes.
Behind the scene, but not actually officially. We witnessed in Lebanon, for example, in the 1980s. But in the case of Syria now, there is this kind of concern of a so-called Arab Spring. There is sort of concern about being involved in this or having any kind of activities related to this in Syria. It's about being away is a better strategy. Just monitor the situation, try to defend yourself. And this is the reason why we see, for example, in recent months, they tried to intervene, but with the consultation with the United States rather than being themselves directly involved.
But haven't Arab leaders acted just like ostriches? They've buried their heads in the sand and think that the problem will go away, somebody else will solve it for them.
This was the trend since 1991 in the region. Actually, even since 1981, since the Iranian Revolution, there is sort of feeling that with the United States help, things can be solved. And this takes to the point where the nature of alliance between Arab countries and the United States, or the West in general, and nothing can be done without being the United States involved in this, because basically it is the interest of the United States to tackle this. There's a feeling also in the region that those organizations basically have their message to the West rather than to those governments, and for this reason we witnessed recently that President Obama and Kerry, they say, okay, look, this is the enemy is behind your door. And this is the message to the Arab countries. You need to be careful of this.
Indeed. Sajjan Gohel, if I can bring you in here, you need to be careful of your enemy. So I suppose moving this conversation a little bit further on, weakening an enemy or defeating an enemy are two very different positions to take. And in Syria, the US, if they are going to take the principal lead, have to consider at what level do you attack, if at all, IS, while they are the IS that is, are fighting Bashar-al-Assad's government?
Well, this has become a very complicated scenario. It started with the simple premise of supporting the Free Syria Army and those opposed to the Assad regime, and it has become far more complex because of the growth of ISIS. And the professor raised an important point earlier about the inaction of the West in dealing with Syria in the first place, which allowed ISIS to grow. That is, of course, there, but it was very difficult to get directly involved because Russia kept using its veto in the UN Security Council. So it would have required unilateral action. Unilateral action, of course, has its controversies because of the 2003 Iraq war. But I think what has also complicated the situation so much is that Syria and Iraq were originally two very separate, distinct problems, but they've now become aligned because of the growth of ISIS. The Assad regime, we already know, has been targeted by a number of different groups and has resulted in a conflict that has displaced millions of people. In Iraq, the policies of Nouri al-Maliki, the former prime minister, in disenfranchising the Sunni Arabs, displacing them, preventing them from having a say in politics and government, that allowed ISIS to regain a foothold inside the country. Sunni Arabs that had felt discriminated started aligning themselves with them. So the problem ended up becoming amalgamated, and that is how the situation is today.
And of course, as we come very close to the end of our programme, let me just bring in Melissa here, because while that problem still festers across Iraq and Syria, there are global concerns. If you look at what's going on around the world, just for your organisation in trying to help various types of refugees and the displaced. We have Iraq, as we've mentioned, Gaza, Libya, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Sudan in terms of Darfur, a famine in Somalia, Central African Republic. Several members of the UN have mentioned about taking their eye off the ball when it comes to refugees in Syria and Iraq. How much prominence do you give the Iraq-Syria problem in comparison to that list I've just mentioned?
In general, we see that the funding comes where the geopolitical interest is greatest. So, of course, we have serious problems raising funds for the victims of the Central African Republic conflict or the South Sudanese conflict now. So we're doing better in fundraising for Syrians, but it's still really not enough. And the more people who are on the run, look at how many, almost 2 million people in 2014 have had to flee for their lives inside Iraq. These people all need to be helped. And so we're kind of, setting up tents and camps and doing what we can to bring them through this period, but we're going to have to go out again and again to appeal for more funds.
There, for the moment, we have to leave it to Professor Zweiri, Professor at Qatar University. Thank you very much for your time. To Melissa Fleming in Vienna and Sajjan Gohel in London, thank you also for being on Inside Syria. And remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria, on air and online. I'm Sohail Rahman. Thanks for watching and for your time and company. Bye for now.